Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and today I'm doing the Choose the Year book tag. This tag was originally created by Mel from Mel's Bookland Adventures, and as usual I will link the original video in the description box. Mel also kindly tagged me in this tag, which I'm very happy about because this is such a fun and creative tag idea, and the idea is pretty simple. You choose a year. She recommends doing your birth year, if you don't mind disclosing that, and then looking at the Goodreads list of the 200 most popular books that were published in that year, and then talk about the ones that you have read or the ones you want to read, and there's a short set of questions about that. The very first question, of course, is choose a year and say why. I looked at my birth year, which I have no problems disclosing, is 1991, and I hadn't read any books from that year. Actually, there was one book that I had read from that year, so not quite enough to do a whole video about the year of 1991. My second pick for a year was somewhere in the 1810s maybe, or the 1890s, far back anyway, but the Goodreads list only goes back to 1919, so it only covers the last 100 years. So then I had a quick look around and I decided to go with the year of 2005. And the reason for that is that I have read a surprising number of books from 2005, and I'm just in a nostalgic mood right now, and I like talking about my teenage years because it makes me feel young. So in 2005 I was a book obsessed 14-year-old, and I feel like the world of literature, especially for teenagers, if we're talking about young adult fiction for example, was very much on a high after J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series was being so successful. So there was a lot of really good YA that I got into during that time, and some of these books, in fact I'd say most of the books that I'm talking about today, are books that you'll at least have heard of if you haven't read them yourself. So I've split the books into two categories. One is books that I read back in 2005 or around that time. I should point out that all of these books are books that I read in translation because as a 14-year-old my English was pretty good for a 14-year-old, but it certainly wasn't good enough to read books in English without having read them in German first. So the first category of books are books that I read back then as a teenager, and the second category of books are books that I read recently that were published in 2005. Let's start with the biggest hit of 2005, the top spot on the Goodreads list, and that is, of course, Twilight by Stephenie Meyer. I remember buying the first book on a summer holiday with my parents in, I can't actually remember exactly which place it was. It was a tiny town somewhere in the Black Forest. We used to go on a lot of holidays in the sort of vicinity of my hometown. I saw Twilight in a bookshop while I was away on holiday, and I thought I should really get it because everyone's talking about this book. I bought it, I read it within like 3 days. So I think Twilight is... I'm really trying really hard to remember anything about the actual story beyond the basic vampire romance plot, because I haven't actually reread it. I read the books once and they're probably still on my parents' bookshelves. I mean, they must have been pretty gripping for me to get through them in such a short amount of time. All of my opinions about Twilight at this point are second-hand because I can't actually remember all that much about the book. I assume it was pretty gripping because I got through it rather quickly. The second book that I have got right here will come to no surprise to anyone, and that is Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. This is the 6th Harry Potter book that was published in 2005, and at this point I was massive Harry Potter fan already. We're desperately waiting for this book to come out, and I really wish I could have read it in English. In fact, it was the 7th book that came out in 2007. That was the first one that I was able to buy the English version without having to wait for the German translation. Not so much for this one. It was a lot of kind of avoiding spoilers until you got your hands on this book. I remember one of my school friends who took the bus to school was so annoyed because he got spoiled about the major plot twist of this novel on the bus because the bus driver was listening to a radio station and they just straight up said it. That is heartbreaking. Next up we have another one of those kind of Hall of Fame type young adult books, and that is The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. When I bought The Book Thief, I had already read his previous novel, I Am the Messenger, which is one of my all-time favourite books. And so I bought The Book Thief, and it's a very good book. I'm sure you've all read it as well, or at least heard about it. It's a story set in World War II in Germany, and it follows a young girl and her family. But the unique selling point of this book is that it is narrated by death. Reading books about World War II as a German, especially books that are not written by Germans, is always a little bit iffy because they get so many things wrong, and it's the same in this book. There are quite a few inaccuracies, not just talking about the language that's used, but other things as well, and that, even as a teenager, did dampen my enjoyment of the book. The next book on my list, also a young adult novel, is one that was so hyped in my personal environment. I think it was actually me who introduced this book to my group of friends who read it first and then said, guys, you have to read this book. And this is Uglies by Scott Westerfeld. This is a dystopian novel set a few hundred years in the future, and the society is, of course, like in all dystopian novels, a seeming utopia. Everyone's healthy, everyone's happy, and everyone is beautiful because at the age of 16 everyone goes through plastic surgery. You can see how this is a very 2005 version of a dystopian novel. I feel like in the mid-2000s we were all very worried about fake beauty, plastic beauty, you know, all of these kind of terms, whereas now I feel like cosmetic procedures have become much more commonplace. Are we moving towards that dystopia? It's not for me to judge, really. I read this book and it's gripping, it's fascinating, it's got amazing world building, it's got a love triangle, which of course is a must for any 2000s YA novel. I think what really sold the book to me and my friends at the time was that the characters in the book have their own little vocabulary, which we instantly copied. Like, we were talking like the characters in the book, we were trying to dress up like the characters in the book. I mean, we never got as far as actually having plastic surgery done at age 14, but I can't say we didn't come close. I have such good memories about just reading it, talking to my friends about it, eagerly awaiting the next book in the series. And maybe that's why I love it so much. I haven't read it for many years because I'm slightly afraid that my memories of this book are tinged with nostalgia and maybe it's not actually as good as I think it is. However, I did recently recommend this book to Mel because she was looking for books to get her daughter, and apparently the daughter really loved it, so clearly it still appeals. By the way, can you see how all of the books I'm talking about are like really big names? 2005 must have been an amazing year for the book industry. The next book is also one you'll all be familiar with. Maybe you haven't read the entire series, but at least you'll have heard of the Lemony Snicket books. And 2005 was the publication year for the 12th book in the series, The Penultimate, Peril. I could not give you a summary of what happens in this book because I really can't remember. I can maybe remember the plots for the first 5 or 6 books and then it just all kind of blends together. Like most kids at that time, I was collecting these books, I was buying them, all of them. I have all of them. Actually, I've lost one. I had all of them, and my particular memory of reading the Lemony Snicket books was reading them under the desk in English class. I had the worst English teacher. I'm sorry if you're watching. Actually, I'm not even sorry if you're watching. We had a strong dislike for each other, and he was really bad at teaching English. So, rebellious me, who didn't value school, just thought I'm better off just reading books under the desk and teaching myself English. And finally, a book that I first read as a teenager in German in 2005 or possibly 2006, I don't know when it actually was translated, that has stayed with me ever since, is Elsewhere by Gabrielle Zevin. And this is a young adult novel that follows a 15-year-old girl from the day of her death throughout her afterlife, really. I don't want to give too much away, but the afterlife, called Elsewhere, is a really interestingly crafted world with some very interesting mechanics, but it doesn't read like a fantasy book. It really does read like a young adult contemporary, because the problems that Liz is facing are very much like any other teenage girls, except that she's dead, which is another big thing that she has to deal with. So this book is about grief, and it's about family, and it's about kind of lost opportunities. This was the first book that made me realise that I really like kind of slow-paced books, because it's not action-paced, it doesn't have a fast plot, it doesn't have a very big plot. A lot of this book is description and characterization, and I realised those are the things I love about books. And maybe that's why I love this so much. This is one of those books I read over and over and over again as a teenager, and that I still recommend today. So if you haven't read Elsewhere by Gabrielle Zevin, go and pick it up. It is a really wonderful story. These were the books that were published in 2005 that I read around that time, but as I was looking through the Goodreads list of books published in 2005, I found a couple that I read very recently. One of them is Freakonomics by Levitt and Dubner, and this is a book that my husband got me I think last year, just as a little present, because he knew that I listened to Freakonomics podcast every week. Freakonomics podcast, if you're unaware of it, is a huge podcast that is kind of built up of interviews with scientists and researchers. It's called Freakonomics. Some of them are economists, but not all of them. Sometimes they interview CEOs or politicians. Sometimes they explore a certain topic, and the topics tend to be kind of around the economic area, but it is not like an economic academic podcast, because I probably wouldn't understand any of that. It's really fun. It's quite America-centric, but it's still a very good podcast. And the podcast is actually based on this book that came out in 2005. And the book, I believe, is based on a blog. So the chapters are kind of short essays about a specific issue. And again, this is quite a dated book because, you know, it's all using research from the mid-2000s, but it's still very interesting, and it hits that perfect spot of being interesting and informative, but also really well written, and written in a very entertaining way that I feel a lot of non-fiction books lack sometimes. And then the last book on my list of books that I've read from 2005 is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. I'm sure I don't have to tell you much about this book because it's one of those booktube favourites, and in fact I only read it after hearing about it on booktube. This is a kind of alternate reality / dystopian novel set in the 1990s, and it's a boarding school novel, which is another reason why I like it. It's like a boarding school novel with a twist. It follows some kids. The narrator is an adult woman by the time that she narrates the story, but she is looking back at her childhood and teenage years at a boarding school. Not going to give much more away than that, but it is a beautiful story. That was question 2 of the tag. Let's move on to question 3. Are there any books published in that year that sound interesting, and would you read them now? Looking at the Goodreads list of books published in 2005, there were a lot of really big titles on there. I'm just going to list them now. Oh, these are all books I haven't read that were published in 2005 that you'll definitely have heard of, like 100% you've heard of these books. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo by Stieg Larsson, The Lightning Thief, which is the first book in the Percy Jackson series by Riordan, A Feast for Crows, which is the 4th Song of Fire and Ice, is that what I called? The Game of Thrones books anyway, by George R.R. Martin. Looking for Alaska by John Green was published in 2005. All of these are books that I would like to read at some point. I have a feeling I'll enjoy the Percy Jackson books. I don't know why I didn't get into them when I was 14. Maybe they weren't that big in Germany at the time, I'm really not sure, but they weren't really on my radar back then. However, there's one book on the list that I'm most drawn to, and that is the I'm not going to be able to pronounce this. The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood, which I believe is a feminist Odyssey retelling. And I know Jean from Jean Bookish Thoughts is really into it, and it's one of her favourite books. So that's the one book from that list that I would most like to pick up and read. Question 4 says, what's the most obscure sounding book? A lot of them. I mean, as much as I'm saying that 2005 was an amazing year for high-selling literature, there are a lot of books on that list that I have not heard of. So let's move on to question 5 instead, which is the strangest book cover. There was one, scrolling through the list, there was one cover that just caught my eye, and it is for a book called The Boyfriend List, 15 Guys, 11 Shrink Appointments, 4 Ceramic Frogs, and Me, Ruby Oliver. And it's by E. Lockhart. This is also a young adult book, sounds like a young adult contemporary. And the book cover is so mid-2000s. I feel like I had at least 3 books that were bright green and pink on the cover. The look of that, the font, the white background, the crazy ceramic frog. It's so dated, and even the way the book sounds, like maybe a teenage Bridget Jones kind of thing. I mean, I'm almost nostalgic for this book, even though I've never read it. So that was the Choose the Year book tag. All that's left for me now is to tag some people. And Mel already tagged a lot of people whose videos I'm interested in seeing. So I'm just going to tag a few that are not on her tag list. And that's Infinite Text, Shmika Likes Books, and Petra Yu. The reason I picked these 3 channels to tag is because all 3 of them read quite a wide variety of books in terms of publication year. All 3 read both classics and contemporary and mid-century novels, you know, really new releases and really old books. So I'd be very interested to see which year they pick. That was it for this video. As always, you can find all of the book titles and links in the description box, so go check that out. I always put a lot of effort into those description boxes, and you'll also find all of the channels linked down below that I've spoken about, and I'll also link the Goodreads top 200s list for 2005. Thank you for watching. Bye!